Good morning, I'm WaywornWyrm, and welcome to my channel. And welcome to episode 12 of The Stolen Land, Back to Oleg's. The day after the discovery of the cairn, the Volso Expedition was continuing to map the grasslands when they encountered 5 bandits. With the grass as short as it was, the two groups first sighted each other fairly far apart. Petra pulled out her short bow and fired as she started closing the distance. Her aim was true and struck one of the bandits in the hip. Lucian pulled out his composite longbow, joining Petra, firing at the same bandit. His arrow pierced the bandit's neck as he was standing back up from being hit with the first arrow. Tiber pulled out his light crossbow and fired a flaming bolt at one of the bandits. It struck her in the chest, and she fell to the ground as the flames started engulfing her. The bandits had their bows out by this point and started firing back. The first one fired at Petra, but the arrow flew wide. The second one fired at Lucian. The arrow found a gap in his thigh armor and buried itself deep into his leg, and he fell down with a scream. The one good thing about being hit so hard by an arrow was the third arrow that had been flying toward him missed as he collapsed. Umbria fired a magic missile from her fingertips, hitting the bandit who hit Lucian. The missile hit him in the shoulder, and it only took a moment for him to recover. But right as he recovered, one of Petra's arrows hit him in the chest, and he stumbled again. Before he could fully recover from the arrow, a bolt from Tiber's crossbow joined Petra's arrow in his chest, and he fell for good. Lucian had recovered enough by that point to fire an arrow at one of the 2 remaining bandits, killing her. The last remaining bandit turned around and ran. Umbria hit him in the back, sending him sprawling, and as he got up, an arrow from Petra hit him in the shoulder, sending him spinning to the ground. As he was sitting on his ass in the grass, suddenly facing those he was running from, trying to make sense of what was happening, a bolt from Tiber hit him between the eyes and ended the fight. Petra stripped the bodies and packed their new belongings on one of the pack horses they used, while Tiber pulled out the arrow and healed Lucian. "You're very lucky, boss." "Was I now?" "Yes, the arrow nicked one of your arteries. If it hadn't stopped where it did, keeping the bleeding somewhat at bay, it could have easily killed you before we had realized what had happened." Lucian nodded at that. "Well, it's a good thing it did stop when it did." Looking up, seeing Petra finishing putting the loot away, he stood up. "We should continue, though. We can't let this stop us." Tiber nodded. He had cast 2 spells to get, mostly, Lucian back to almost healthy. He'd have to take a look at it when they camped for the night. He hoped beyond hope that this would be the most exciting thing that happened to them all day. That night on watch, Tiber thanked Sarenrae for listening to his hope and making the rest of the day pass with the second most exciting thing of the day being him having to sharpen one of his quills for the chronicle he was writing. In fact, the next 4 days went by very similarly. There was nothing to note as they finished mapping the grasslands, part of the Greenbelt. On the morning of the 6th day, after finding the cairn, Lucian told them what the plan for the next stage was as they were finishing up breakfast. "We'll head back to Oleg's to sell the bandit loot and the boar skins we have. This is the rest of the boar meat, so enjoy it, as we're going to have to start eating trail rations again by tonight. After we leave Oleg's, we'll start exploring the forest called the Narlmarches. My understanding of the topography is we will be fine as we map the east section nearest to Oleg's, but once we get west of the Skunk River, will be in swampland for the rest of the time we spend mapping it. Also, we'll have to be careful once we get into the swamp section, because the swamp continues past what we've been tasked with mapping. But, back to more immediate plans. We'll map down to the Thorn River, near where the bandit camp we destroyed almost 2 months ago was. Then we'll start mapping within 6 miles of the river, going upriver until it ends not too far from where we just finished mapping 2 days ago. Then we'll map the section of the forest outside that 6-mile sweep that we'll be going around later today. By that time, we'll probably have to make another stop at Oleg's. Each member of the party nodded. This is not really what any of them had expected when they decided to become adventurers. There was a lot more marching all day and mapping than they had anticipated. A lot more stops to a frontier outpost. A lot more nights spent sleeping in a bedroll under an open sky. And oddly, a lot less instances of almost dying than any of the other 3 had anticipated. It was not the largest problem in the world, however, as Oleg and Svetlana were very nice people. The garrison of 5 soldiers with infrequent patrols on top of that also helped them feel safe when they were behind Oleg's walls. Even more helpful was the destruction of the Thorn River bandit camp. It hadn't stopped bandits in the areas of the Greenbelt closest to Oleg's, as a few days ago had proven, but it had significantly lowered the number of bandits. Without a local base of operations, there was no safe place to camp or store loot for a several-day travel now, and every other direction from wherever exactly this stag lord held his base of operations had local bases of operation, if not as much trade as this part of the Greenbelt had. The trip back to Oleg's was rather uneventful, even though it took all day. Oleg and Svetlana were happy to see them back, and Svetlana cheerfully altered the amount of dinner she was making to accommodate the addition of the expedition. As was normally the case, the 8 of them, including Jode and Keston, stayed up late into the night in the main house of the trading post, drinking and talking and laughing. Keston's 4 soldiers kept to themselves, as was usual, and stayed by their small camp just inside the walls. Eventually, Lucian and party stumbled into the bunkhouse and slept the sleep of those at peace. The next morning dawned early and bright. Summer was reaching its peak, and it was here with a vengeance. Lucian went to meet with Oleg. "Oleg, I have a sale for you." Oleg, who was helping Keston with some logistical things, looked up. "Yes? What did you bring back for me this time, Lucian?" "Firstly, I brought back 2 boar skins prepared by our ever-lovely Umbria." Oleg nodded. Umbria had quite the skill with hide-working, and had her path been different, less academic, Oleg was sure she would have made a peerless hunter. "Good, those will fetch a good price. Any boar meat?" Lucian shook his head as he reached the table set up in the yard, and sat next to Oleg and Keston. "No meat. We spent most of this trip eating boar meat, and it saved us in eating trail rations for the majority of it. Although, I do have 5 sets of leather armor, short swords, and longbows with a quiver of arrows each." Keston looked up at this. "Oleg, if you make this deal, I have someone who will buy these from you." Oleg looked over to Keston. "Oh, yes?" he asked with a cocked eyebrow. "Is that person you?" Keston chuckled. "No, but you're not far off. In this era of growing tension in Brevoy, Restov is growing its guard force as much as it can. It could always use more arms and armor. Then, quickly looking over to Lucian, you're not an established merchant, so Restov won't deal with you. Especially since you are under contract by the Sword Lords. The government buying from itself is at least somewhat frowned on. Both Oleg and Lucian nodded at what XII had to say. Then Oleg looked to Lucian. Then it's settled. I'll buy the loot from the newest bandit corpses from you, and, turning back to XII, he continued, quickly sell it to you as a representative of the Restov guard force. XII held up his hands. Not quite so fast, but I will put a note together with the materials for the next wagon to Restov that leaves here. Lucian smiled at Oleg. I'm glad to hear that once again you are buying everything I'm selling. Before we leave, we'll have it all unpacked for you and put in your storage area. I'm also glad you're expanding what you carry. We will be by one of these days to buy most of it from you. Thank you so much for listening to The Stolen Land, Episode 12. Make sure you tune in tomorrow, which will be Friday, for my Friday show, where I go over sort of a weekly wrap-up and talk about whatever I feel like. Thank you.